This happened when I was 11. I was living in the US at the time with my parents. We had bought a nice big house in a nice neighborhood, giant backyard and all. We'd been living at this particular house for about 6 months, so we'd well and truly settled into the place. I got my first dog and everything. As a kid, this was a real highlight in my life. One day when I came home from school, my mom took me aside as soon as I had arrived at home. She needed to tell me something, so she sat me down. Turns out, when my dad arrived home from work, he noticed one of our garden chairs had been taken from our back garden and brought around to one of the side windows at the front, which happened to be my parents' bedroom window. After checking it out, someone had removed about half of the ceiling that held the window in its frame. With the chair still at the scene, it was concluded that whoever it had been had gotten spooked, likely by my dad getting up in the middle of the night, and whoever it was had bolted. Pretty scary stuff, knowing that someone had tried to get into one of our windows. Not even an open or unlocked window at that. The motherfucker tried to take the actual window out. When it came to things like this, my mom had a great way of speaking to me like an adult without scaring me. So while I was cautious, I wasn't too worried. She ended up taking a few new hobbies, like meeting me off the bus and checking in on me in the middle of every night. I'm an only child and was a pretty independent kid, so this was a bit strange, but I understood her reasoning. We figured it was an attempt at petty theft, so we left it at that. Besides, what could happen, really? My dad was a pretty big dude, and I had this awesome new guard dog. I felt very safe. Over the course of the next few weeks, a few of our neighbors were broken into and burglarized, and amongst a few attempts at our house. So we had a thief on our hands. In that time, my dad stepped up home security. A few motion lights here and an extra lock there. About a week passed before it happened again. My mum could hear someone walking around outside on the side of the house, so she crept up and tried to sneak a look. She couldn't see anything, so she went around the house looking through each window. She knew someone was there, but she just couldn't catch a glimpse of him. This was the catalyst that started a month from hell. In order to keep this from getting too long, I'll summarize what happened up until the night we caught this prick. My mom became a wreck. She moved herself into the spare room at the front of the house so she could see out the bigger window and be nearer to my room. Sometimes she'd sleep in the living room because you could see both the living room and kitchen windows. She always had a golf club with her, lost sleep, and her work suffered. During this time, my dad wasn't exactly the hero we'd all expect. He's a dead heavy sleeper, and chalked it all up to my mom being paranoid. One evening, when she could hear the creep, she tried to wake him up, and he promptly went back to sleep. Great effort, Dad. By this point in my life, I had become a night owl. I'd stay up until late to watch Adult Swim and chill with my dog. One night at about 1:30 a.m., I was sitting in my room doing just that. Suddenly, Jeffrey had this deep, menacing rumble coming from him. He'd been with us for a while by this time, and I'd never heard anything quite like this. I asked him what was up, and he just carried on with this alien noise, staring dead center at one of my windows, as if he could see through the damn thing. The blinds were drawn, so I sat, silently freaking out, imagining what was on the other side of that wall, and how it was making my dog do this. Not 1 minute later, I heard my mom scream at the top of her lungs, and I quote, "What the fuck? Yeah, I've seen you now, fucker." Time pretty much stopped then and there. I don't know if it was my kid imagination, but I shit you not, in that moment, Jeffrey and I looked at each other, both mouth agape and frozen by what we heard. I don't really remember getting up and running through the hall to my living room, but I got there just in time to see my sweet little mum fly out that fucking door with her trusty golf club, chasing this motherfucker down like Usain Bolt chasing the gold. I've never seen her move so fast. By this time, my dad had decided to wake up enough to come through to take the reins and call the police. Jeff had bolted out the door after my mom, and at one point caught up with her before she stopped at the end of the street. She was screaming anything and everything at this point, from "I'll get you" to "you're fucking done," to incoherent messes. I watched like a drone as she came back to the house, dog in tow, and I just sat down on the couch, entirely unsure of what had just happened. She took the phone and gave them a perfect description. He had been walking around the front of the house where she was in the spare room. By this point, we'd installed motion lights. This guy just wouldn't let up. Autumn was upon us, and leaves were falling, so she heard the crunch outside. She timed it perfectly to get a good look at the guy. After a month, she finally saw him past that window when she happened to be looking out, and his face was flooded with light from the new motion light situated by the window. Apparently he heard her when she screamed, and paused like a deer caught in literal headlights. He looked dead straight into the window before taking off down the road. It took about 5 minutes for the police to arrive. A few cars had been dispatched, one of them to us and the rest out to the neighboring streets. 10 minutes later, one of them got a call to say they got him. Soon he was parked up on the street in a cruiser, so my mom could identify him, and sure enough, it was him. They grabbed him a few streets up from our house. This is the part that makes my stomach turn. Turns out he wasn't just the persistent klepto we had believed. I was standing by the front door when I heard through one of the officer's radios, "Insert name, registered sex offender." I was a bit naive at this point. I kind of got what that meant, but it wasn't until I was older and was talking to my mom about it that a few more details came about. Unbeknownst to me, my mom was very much aware of what had happened with this guy. Turns out he'd been convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl. I'm not sure how long he was in for, but at some point he managed to get out and moved into one of the houses a few streets over from us. Coincidentally, in viewpoint of where I'd get on and off the school bus. He was on parole, and so was promptly thrown back in jail immediately. This is where my knowledge of him ends, and I've never wanted to pursue knowing anything more. Even worse, one of our family friends that lived on the same street as him had received a letter to say he was registered and staying in our area. I shit you not. We were within a 3-minute walk from our house. We saw this woman so often, we still don't really get how or why she had never thought to bring it up. She had 2 kids herself. We ended up moving to the UK 2 months later for reasons unrelated. I won't lie, that time was pretty stressful. We didn't feel entirely comfortable in our own home anymore, and moving to another country kind of wrecked me at that age. Once we started our new life here, I didn't think much of it after that. I had bigger issues. This guy was persistent, but he was in jail, and wasn't going to be able to travel to the UK to get me. I was rational about my fear of him, so I found it easy to move on at that time. I thought about it a lot more the older I've gotten, so I guess this is more cathartic than anything else. So these incidents started about 6 years ago, and went on for a couple of years. I used to be really into the music scene, going to shows and festivals every chance I got. This often meant meeting random people, whose names I would forget about 5 seconds later. As a result of being out in Atlanta nightlife so often, I got frequent requests on Facebook, and a naive younger me blindly accepted them, assuming they were just people I had met at shows that I was too drunk or distracted to remember. One day, I got a message from someone named Eddie. His Facebook profile picture was of someone at least a decade older than me, with long, scraggly hair. He looked harmless enough, just another show-going hippie, I assumed. His message simply asked if I was the girl that danced a half circle around him at the local show last night and then twirled dreamily away, or something along those lines. This was way back in 2012, so I don't remember the exact words. I responded that I had no recollection of that, and upon further investigation, I saw that he lived in an entirely different state, so it couldn't have been me. He told me that I must have had a doppelganger out there somewhere, and I left the conversation at that. Over the next few months, I'd get random notifications that he had messaged me, asking if I'd be at various shows across the southeast and the like. I mostly ignored the messages, but would very occasionally respond, shortly expressing interest in a band he had mentioned. I was just trying to be polite. Why the younger me felt the need to be polite to everyone is beyond me. I've since learned that it's okay to not respond to persistent internet strangers. The messages became more and more frequent, so I just started to leave them unread. Again, why I didn't block him is beyond me. I guess I thought he was just harmless and a bit lonely. Fast forward about a year. It's summer of 2013, and two of my best friends and I are caravanning to Wakarusa, a music festival that took place in Ozark, Kansas. It was about a 13-hour drive from Atlanta, but totally worth it. We went every year. An important note here is that this wasn't some small, intimate festival. It hosted upwards of 40,000 people, and it was often hard to keep track of my friends, let alone find people who I knew came separately. So my friends and I are on a blanket in the middle of a huge crowd, watching widespread panic. It's nighttime, so the only lights are coming from the stage and random LED toys or glow sticks or whatever. Out of nowhere, someone beelines for our blanket, makes himself at home next to me without permission, and strikes up a conversation. My group of friends is generally warm and accepting, and it wasn't unusual to make random friends at a big hippie fest like this, so we thought nothing of it at first. Probably just someone high on ecstasy and looking for a bit of company. It wasn't until he started referencing me in my Facebook personally that the alarm bells started going off. This was Eddie. I had honestly completely forgotten about him and his persistent messages, and in the darkness there was no way I could have recognized him. He was talking like we were old friends, and tried to follow us around all night. Once I subtly alerted the others about who he was, we made every excuse in the book to try to leave, go back to our campsite, and call it a night. He was painfully insistent on following us back there. Obviously, I didn't want him to know where I slept, so I tried to appease him by saying I was exhausted, but that we could try and meet up again tomorrow. Dumb, I know. I was just doing anything I could to get him away in the moment, and had no intention of actually following through. He finally left us alone after that, and we walked a long roundabout way to our campsite, just in case he had watched or tried to follow at a distance. The next day, I made an avid point to avoid the area where we ran into Eddie and discussed meeting up. The festival venue was so huge, I figured there was no way he'd find me again. I was beside a small stage in the back corner of the venue, hooping in the woods with my friends, when I noticed him out of the corner of my eye. He was standing beside a tree all alone, watching me with a weird smile. It reminded me of a proud dad watching his young daughter play, but with a way creepier and more sinister overtone. Still, he hadn't done or said anything explicitly creepy or threatening, but his presence was so unsettling that I grabbed my friends and we pretended that we had forgotten about a set that was starting, so we ran out of the wooded stage area. I remember hoping he didn't notice I had seen him. The festival ended the next day, and I was relieved to not see him again. Fast forward about another year. At this point I barely used Facebook, and had all but forgotten about Eddie. My friend that I went to the festival with was visiting from out of town that night, and we were going to get some drinks. He got to my house and we were catching up, and the subject of the festival came up. We started talking about Eddie, and how weird that whole situation was, but at this point it was less creepy and more of a strange memory. I told him Eddie used to message me all the time, but I had stopped opening them years ago. Naturally, my friend wanted to look through the messages, so I obliged. We began to scroll through them, and I realized just how dire of a mistake it may have been to not block him. He had started by asking me what shows I was going to, what part of Atlanta I lived in, not taking the hint that I clearly had no interest in responding at that point. Then, as the months went by, he was sending me links to tickets he had bought for me to shows in Atlanta, links to tickets he had bought for us to go together. There was one message asking where he could pick me up for a show that was 2 hours away in Athens, and that he couldn't wait to see me again. The messages continued to go on, but at this point I was so creeped out I immediately blocked him, finally, and closed the computer wide-eyed. What the actual fuck? He sounded like he was carrying on an entire relationship with me, without my consent. He never acknowledged the fact that I literally hadn't responded to or even seen a message from him in over a year. Shaken up, we decided to just go get a drink and stop thinking about this weirdo. We get to Edgewood, a popular bar district in my city, and walk to our favorite small bar to get a drink. As soon as we walk into the bar, my heart sinks to the pit of my stomach. To this day, this was the creepiest and most coincidental moment that's ever happened. I see Eddie sitting at the far end of the bar. His face lights up as soon as I walk in, and he motions me over. He says something along the lines of, "I can't believe it's you," and starts firing off questions about me, my life, what I've been up to. At this point, the darkest feeling washes over me. I just feel unsafe and exposed. Why is he here? He doesn't even live in Georgia. I quickly tell him I have to use the restroom, but I'll be back to the bar for a drink. I grab my friend, who's equally in shock, and we speed walk around the corner to the bathrooms and then past them. I'll be forever grateful that the door to the patio area was just past the bathrooms, so we got a head start. We get outside, hop the fence, and start running to my car. I glance behind us, and Eddie somehow figured out in those 15 seconds that we left, even though you can't see the bathrooms from where he was sitting. He was walking rapidly across a crosswalk in our direction, eyes on me. We book it to my car and get the hell out of Edgewood as quickly as we can. Shaken, I drive us around for about an hour, before eventually going home to make sure we weren't followed. As inconclusive as this whole thing was, that was the last time I ever saw Eddie, and I wonder if this was just a string of coincidences, or if it was more sinister. After all, he didn't even live in Georgia. Why was he at one of my favorite bars alone, the night I happened to go through all of his old messages? Had he somehow gotten a hold of my location via Facebook? I made sure all my location services were off when I checked my phone, so to this day I have no idea how he ended up there, or what his intentions were. I wrote out this story back in 2015 when it happened, because I wanted to remember the details. It was genuinely scary when it occurred. For as long as I can remember, I'd been afraid of being watched by people in the woods or through the windows. Movies like The Stranger scared the crap out of me. One night, we were invited to a backyard fire at our good friend's home. He lives on one of the main drags in our city, and the house sits directly to the left of one of the city's main walking trails. They have a high fence along the side of the backyard adjacent to the trail, but at the rear of the garden, the fence is a waist-high chain-link jobby with a gate. Luckily for our friend Shane, his house also sits on a greenback. The property is very private with large trees and bushes just outside the back fence. In order to access the gate and the fence in the rear from the outside, you'd have to make your way through a lot of low shrubs and trees. It was nice. We felt safe there. Not that we live in a rough-and-tumble area, but we generally feel safe. A crowd of us were stood around the fire pit having a few brew and smoking a few tokes. All the guys grew up together, so we were reminiscing about our childhoods. The story of Dickie Tag came up. It's probably exactly what you think it is. Then again, maybe not. Young kids running around with their birds out, either tagging each other with their dickies or tagging each other's flailing wieners. The rules are still unclear, We had a solid buzz going, and we were roaring, laughing, and crying from the belly laughs. It was a hilarious discussion, debating on who had actually played this perverted game. So there we are, all yelling about this Dickie tag, Kendrick Lamar on bust and having a great time, when one of the girls, Mel, is trying to get the group's attention. This goes on for about 45 seconds to a minute, before anyone pays any heed. When we finally shut up and can hear her, she points to the back fence near the gate and says, "There's a person stood there." We all turn and look, and lo and behold, there's a random dude stood in the dark, jiggling at the fence. We shut off the tunes and Shane and Mitch walk towards him. They ask, "What's on the go, man?" My initial thought was maybe we were being too loud yelling about dicks. This is a family neighborhood after all. The stranger in the dark responds with, "I'm just a little bit lost." This is when the creepiness starts. Shane responds by asking him how he could possibly be lost. The path is 20 feet in the other direction. The stranger tells us he's a 10-year Army combat veteran and begins to walk away. He stops after 5 feet and looks back. Shane then yells at him, "What are you doing, man? You're watching us in the woods being a creep. Get the fuck out of here." The man walks a few more feet and turns and stares again. For a second time, Shane tells him to get away from the backyard. The stranger makes his way back onto the path and looks again. Shane and Mitch at this point both tell him to stop staring and get the hell out of here. They all but huss him down the path. At this point, we're all pretty creeped out. We have no idea how long this guy was stood there in the woods before Mel noticed him. The entire back of the house is woods, so we didn't know if the guy actually went on his way or if he looped back and was creeping around. The crowd is all having a discussion about what had transpired and beginning to relax again. The buddy was probably drunk anyways. We're known for our drink where I come from. Not 15 minutes later, along the side of the garden that's adjacent to the trail, I noticed someone walking down the path. I thought this was odd based on what just happened, as well as the time of night. The person walks along and looks in on us, then stops and approaches the fence. I yell out above the conversation that someone is by the fence again, so all 6 of the men present walk over. It was the same man again, but he had approached us from the opposite direction we had shot him in moments before. The guy starts by saying, "I was only joking, you guys." At this point, Shane had got a solid buzz on, and's not impressed that this creeper was back. Jaina, who's the level-headed one, also goes over to mediate the conversation. She finds out his name and that he's looking for directions to another main road in the city, located about 15 minutes north of where we were. He tells her again that he's a 10-year-old Army combat veteran. Between her and the men, they point the creeper in the right direction and he starts to walk. Still sketched out, one of the guys watches him and where he goes. Instead of going up the road as instructed, they watch him try and enter the private backyard of the house across the street. He gets yelled at again by Shane to go up the road and not onto someone's private property. There are a few choice words said. Buddy is in the middle of the busy road and almost gets struck by a truck, but he finally makes his way up the road. We watch until he's out of sight. Now we're sufficiently spooked. I mean, chances are this guy was tweaking on drugs or having a mental breakdown. Either way, he was acting unpredictable. It wasn't sitting well with Mel, so she chose to alert the police, just to let them know that a potentially intoxicated man is causing minor disturbances. The police were exceptionally interested in Mel's call. They wanted to know exactly where we saw this guy, what he was wearing, and when we saw him last. 3 cruisers and a ghost car showed up within minutes. Mel and Jaina took the bullet and went to talk to the police in person. They got asked a lot of questions, and of course provided all the detail they could. It was at this point Mel noticed the police dog. She asked if we should be worried. Is this guy a threat? She was told, no, you should be fine, by the officer, and that they were just trying to find him. We stay in the backyard and watch the police and the dog go down the path with flashlights. Another officer goes up the road on foot looking for the stranger. Eventually, the show dies down, and our crowd decides to Google the creeper's name and see if there's any news stories. The first hit is contact info for a person of the same name, who lives in the community the guys are from. The exact community we were laughing about talking about Dickie Tag. Kind of creepy. A total coincidence, but still spooky. The second hit is a story about a body that was found in the city's largest park about 5 years ago. There was no name in the story, but as we scrolled down to the comments, the creeper's name was there. He had written a comment on this story, and all it said was, "Rest in peace, Shane." We haven't seen anything in the news about what may have transpired with this man. I hope he's safe, and didn't hurt himself or anyone else. Either way, he scared the shit out of us, and gave us a great campfire tale for years to come.